All right, everybody, buckle up, because today we are going to be diving headfirst into the world of Army Doctrine for Defense Support of Civil Authorities,
You got it.
or as it's more commonly known, DSCA.
That's right.
We're talking about the Army's playbook
That's it.
for when things go south
Yeah.
here on the home front,
Absolutely.
and we need to call in the big guns.
Yep.
Now, we've got a real treat for you today.
Yeah, we do.
We're going deep on ADP 328,
3-28.
focusing on Chapter 4, Response.
Yeah, the meat and potatoes, right, of how this whole thing worked.
The who, the what, the when, and the where of how the Army responds
That's right.
to crises right here in the U.S.
Absolutely.
So let's just jump right in, shall we?
Let's go.
So this ADP, it's not exactly a walk in the park, is it?
Well, I mean, it can be a little dense, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But it's important stuff, you know.
Right.
It really lays out the ground rules for how, and importantly, when the Army gets involved in domestic situations.
And it's not like a one-size-fits-all approach, is it?
No, not at all. That's what makes it so interesting, honestly. We've got procedures for everything under the sun.
Yeah.
I mean, you name it, we've probably got a plan for it.
Right, because a hurricane in Florida needs a very different response than, say, a cyber attack that takes down the power grid in, I don't know, the Northeast.
Yeah, exactly. Each situation has its own unique wrinkles and challenges.
So let's take a hypothetical here. Let's say we've got a major earthquake, right? And the local first responders are just overwhelmed. Who makes the call to bring in the National Guard?
That's a great question. So in that scenario, the call ultimately rests with the state's governor.
So it's not like the president just sweeps in and says, send in the troops.
No. This is about states taking the lead with their own resources first.
Right.
And then when it becomes clear they need an extra hand, that's when the governor steps in.
Okay, so the governor's the one with the authority.
Exactly.
But they're not just like throwing darts at a board.
Yeah.
Right.
No, not at all. It's a very calculated decision.
Right.
Based on a lot of real-time information.
Yeah.
Coming from folks like the state's emergency management agency and the National Guard's Joint Force Headquarters. They're getting updates constantly, assessing the situation and advising the governor on the best course of action.
So it's a very informed decision.
Precisely.
Okay, so the National Guard gets called in. Now we're cooking, right?
That's right.
But even then, it's not as simple as just National Guard, go do stuff. We've got this whole duty status thing to consider, right?
Ah, yes, duty status, the age-old question. Title 10, Title 32, state active duty.
Yeah.
What does it all mean? It can be a bit of a head-scratcher, for sure. It all boils down to who's in charge or where the money's coming from.
Right, because it's not always crystal clear.
No, it's definitely nuanced.
So break it down for us. What's the difference between these and why should we care?
Okay, so let's say we've got a hurricane bearing down on the coast, right? If the National Guard gets activated under Title 32, they're technically still under the command of the state governor.
So the governor's still calling the shots?
Yep, but here's the kicker. The funding is coming from the feds.
So it's like a joint operation.
Exactly. It's this unique hybrid status. They're still part of the state's forces, but they're operating with federal dollars and resources.
So they're wearing two hats at the same time.
That's a great way to put it.
That's wild.
Hmm.
But what happens when a situation is so bad that even the National Guard with their two hats and everything are stretched thin? Like, imagine a massive earthquake affecting multiple states. Does California just start airlifting in avocados to help people cope?
Well, avocados are important, but no. That's where those EMAC agreements come in.
EMAC agreements.
Yeah, the Emergency Management Assistance Compact. It's basically a fancy way of saying states helping states. Think of it like a mutual aid pact. California can call up the National Guard from, say, Arizona or Nevada to help out.
That's like a buddy system for states?
Yeah, exactly. It's all about interstate cooperation and making sure that resources can be deployed wherever they're needed most.
That makes sense. But here's a curveball. What about civil unrest? Can a state call on another state's National Guard for help with, like, a riot or something?
Ah, good question. So here's the interesting thing about EMAC. It usually doesn't cover those types of situations like civil disturbances or typical law enforcement activities. Those require a whole separate agreement. They're much more sensitive.
Right, because you've got posse comitatus and all of that.
Exactly.
So it's like there's a whole web of agreements and protocols in place to ensure the response is swift and appropriate.
That's the name of the game.
No matter the crisis.
Exactly.
We want to be ready for anything.
Absolute preparedness is key.
Now that brings up another question. what happens when even that interstate support, those EMAC agreements, they're just not enough? We're
So
talking situations where the entire country's watching, the stakes are incredibly high. Think Hurricane Katrina, the LA earthquake. These are the kinds of events that trigger a Stafford Act declaration, right?
you got it. When you've got a disaster that just overwhelms everything, even the combined resources of multiple states, that's when the federal government's like, all right, we got to bring in the big guns. We're talking full-on federal military support.
So the cavalry's arrive, but this isn't just a quick phone call, right? There's got to be a process, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. You can't just flip a switch and deploy federal troops. Let's say you've got a massive hurricane making landfall, right? Local and state resources are tapped out. The request for federal assistance, it goes up through FEMA or maybe another agency, all the way to the Department of Defense.
So there's a whole chain of command there. We got to make sure it's the right call.
Exactly. And even then, the DOD, they're not just going to be like, sure, send in the troops. They're going to want to analyze the situation carefully.
So who's doing that analysis? Is there like a special disaster room somewhere in the Pentagon?
Well, not quite a disaster room, but close. A lot of that responsibility falls on the combatant command for that region. So, like, if that hurricane hit the East Coast, we're talking U.S. North CONCOM.
Right. They're the ones who would be like, okay, here's what we're seeing. Here's what we recommend.
Exactly. They're going to be evaluating the situation, what resources are needed, coordinating the military's response. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Because once you bring in those federal forces, the command structure, it gets a little more complex.
Okay, so walk me through this. Who's actually calling the shots on the ground? Who's handling all the logistics? How does this multi-layered system actually work when things get real?
So imagine this, right?
Hmm.
You're deployed to help with, say, earthquake relief. Suddenly, that base you're at, it's buzzing. It's become this hub of activity. That's your BSI, your base support installation, kicking into gear.
The BSI, so that's like our home base for the whole DSCA operation.
You got it. It's your supply depot, your command center, all rolled into one. And ADP 328, it really emphasizes choosing the right BSI. Got to be strategically located, got to be equipped to handle whatever that disaster throws at us.
Makes sense, right? You don't want to be running your disaster response out of a broom closet.
Exactly. So you've got the BSI humming along, and then at the heart of it all, you've got the Joint Task Force, the JTF. They're the ones really running the show.
So the JTF is like the conductor, making sure all the different instruments are playing in sync.
Perfect analogy. They're responsible for actually executing the mission, coordinating all the different units and resources. And then you've got the DCO, the Defense Coordinating Officer. They're like the liaison between the military and the civilian world.
So they're the ones making sure everyone's on the same page, that we're actually meeting the needs of the civilians we're there to help.
You got it. It's a team effort, for sure.
Sounds like a well-oiled machine when it works right. But what about those times when you don't have the luxury of time? I mean, we're talking about disasters here. Sometimes you got to act fast.
Oh, absolutely. That's where immediate response authority comes into play. Picture this. You're a platoon leader, right? You're responding to a flood. Water's rising. People are trapped. Every second counts.
Talk about pressure. You've got lives on the line.
Exactly. And that's why this doctrine, it lays out very specific situations where commanders on the ground, they can make those critical decisions without having to wait for approval from higher up.
So if there's an immediate threat, they can just act.
In certain cases, yes. Think like urban search and rescue, immediate medical aid, securing a chemical spill. Those first 72 hours, they're crucial. This doctrine, it recognizes that sometimes you got to move fast.
So you're saying there are times when a local commander could potentially deploy troops without waiting for the official green light?
In very specific time-sensitive scenarios, yes. But it's not a free-for-all, obviously. It's still about working within the law, within the doctrine.
Right. We're not just throwing the rule book out the window.
Exactly. Controlled chaos? Maybe.
Yeah.
But controlled nonetheless.
So it sounds like this whole ADP, it's all about providing those clear guidelines, those procedures to make sure that no matter what kind of crisis we're facing, our response is swift, it's effective, and most importantly, it's lawful.
100%. And that brings us to another critical aspect of DSCA, and that's the actual tasks the Army might be called upon to perform during a domestic response. What are the boots on the ground actually doing?
Okay, so we've talked about who's in charge, how decisions are made. Let's get into the nitty-gritty. What are those soldiers actually doing when they get called up for a DSCA mission? All right, so we've talked about who's calling the shots, how those decisions are made during a DSCA mission, but what about the actual tasks? What's the Army actually doing? What are we talking about here, practically speaking?
Well, ADP 328, it lays out 4 core DSCA tasks, and they cover a pretty wide range, from your classic disaster relief all the way to supporting civilian law enforcement.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one. What's the first one on the list?
So the first one, and this is probably what most people think of when they hear DSCA, is support for domestic disasters. We're talking hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, those big events that just completely overwhelm local resources.
Right, those are the images we usually see on the news, right? Soldiers handing out supplies, clearing debris, helping communities get back on their feet.
Exactly. It's about providing that immediate aid, helping to restore those essential services, getting things back to some sense of normalcy after a disaster hits.
Yeah, getting the lights back on, getting clean water flowing, all that good stuff.
Absolutely. But it's not all about natural disasters. The second core task, that's where things get a little more, well, specialized. We're talking support for domestic CBRN incidents.
CBRN, right. So now we're talking hazmat suits, decontamination zones, that kind of thing.
You got it. Chemical spills, biological threats, radiological incidents, these require a whole different level of training and equipment.
Definitely adds another layer of complexity to the whole DSCA picture. It's not just handing out water bottles anymore.
No, not at all. And then we've got the third core task, which is support for domestic civilian law enforcement agencies.
Now this one always seems to be a bit of a hot topic, right? Given posse comitatus and that whole idea of limiting the military's role in domestic law enforcement.
Yeah, you're right. It's a delicate balance for sure. The Posse Comitatus Act, that's all about maintaining that separation of powers, making sure the military isn't being used to enforce civilian law.
Right, we're not becoming a police state.
Exactly. So the way the Army supports law enforcement, it's usually in an indirect capacity.
More about lending a hand than taking charge.
Perfect way to put it. Think of it like providing equipment, logistics, maybe intelligence support, things that help law enforcement do their job, but without actually crossing that line into direct law enforcement duties. We're there to support, to be a force multiplier, not to replace them.
Makes sense. So we've covered disaster relief, CBRN incidents, law enforcement support. What's the fourth core task? What do we missed?
So the fourth one, it's kind of a catch-all category.
Yeah.
Other designated domestic support,
Yeah.
basically anything that doesn't neatly fit into those first 3 buckets.
So it's like the miscellaneous drawer of DSCA.
Yeah, you could say that. This could include things like supporting security efforts during big events, like the Olympics or something like that, or even providing logistical support during a pandemic.
Speaking of pandemics, I know ADP 328, it actually addresses pandemic response specifically, which, given recent history, feels incredibly relevant, right?
It's essential. I mean, we all saw firsthand how the Army was called upon during COVID-19. And it wasn't just about setting up field hospitals or giving out vaccines. You had potential civil unrest, supply chains that needed securing, even helping to enforce quarantines. This doctrine, it helps to navigate those really sensitive situations.
It really does highlight how broad the scope of scenarios is that the Army has to be ready for these days. It's not just about fighting battles on foreign soil anymore. Speaking of which, earlier we were talking about immediate response authority, those situations where you don't have time to wait for orders from higher ups. How do those rules of engagement, how do those work on U.S. soil? I mean, that's got to be a completely different ballgame compared to a combat zone, right?
You're absolutely right. Totally different context. We're talking about potentially engaging with U.S. citizens on U.S. soil, and that comes with a whole different set of rules and considerations.
So instead of those typical rules of engagement, those ROEs we always hear about, we're talking about SRUF.
Exactly. Standing Rules for the Use of Force, SRUF. Those are specifically designed for domestic operations, and they are much more restrictive than what you'd see in a combat zone. The use of force, it's always an absolute last resort, and it's always subject to intense scrutiny.
I imagine that takes a lot of training, a lot of discipline, especially for soldiers who are used to operating in a combat environment. So how does ADP 328, how does it guide those actions in a way that maintains public trust, even in those high-pressure situations?
That's really the crux of it, right? It all boils down to ensuring that every action taken during a DSCA mission, whether it's deploying troops or even just interacting with the public, it has to be done lawfully, ethically, and with the utmost respect for the Constitution and the citizens that we've sworn to protect.
It's a heavy responsibility, there's no doubt about that. But it's also a testament to the professionalism, the adaptability of the men and women in uniform. They have to be ready for anything these days, from natural disasters to pandemics to civil unrest, all while upholding those highest standards.
Couldn't have said it better myself. DSCA, it's complex, it's constantly evolving. And ADP 328, it's that vital roadmap to navigate it all. It ensures the military is ready to support and protect no matter what challenges we face here at home.
Well, folks, we've covered a lot of ground today, from the chain of command all the way down to the specific tasks and rules of engagement that govern DSCA. One thing's for sure. This doctrine, it's not just for the lawyers and the policy wonks. It's essential reading for anyone who might be involved in these situations.
Absolutely. It's the playbook for ensuring a coordinated, effective, and most importantly, a lawful response. And it's all about striking that balance between being ready for anything and respecting the rights of our fellow citizens.
If you're preparing for your next assignment, or if you just want to better understand the military's role here at home, I encourage you to check out ADP 328. You might be surprised at what you learn. Until next time, this has been The Deep Dive.